Okay, so we're going to narrow our focus for the rest of the day around this idea of creating the business case for habitat programs. So obviously that's our big theme. And particularly for those of you who have been involved in working group meetings in the past, you know this is definitely a topic we've touched on many, many times before. It's come up in presentations, breakout discussions, side conversations, so clearly it's a really important one. And I think, even for those of us who personally see and understand the conservation opportunities that are before us, the challenge is still there to make the business case for it, to pitch to the decision makers in our organization, and ultimately to align our conservation activities with our organization's operational objectives. So I've asked Kristine Nemec, who helps manage a really successful integrated roadside vegetation management program in Iowa through the Tallgrass Prairie Center. I've asked her to help me introduce some of these ideas that we're going to be talking about today. And then we'll move on into the more in-depth presentations that make up the rest of the agenda. So for the past year, in our free time, Kristine and I have been working on this concept that I think lies somewhere between a white paper, a literature review, maybe a resources manual. And the idea came actually from one of our first or second working group meetings. And it stemmed from this observation that in many cases, what we're asking to do when we look at habitat opportunities, particularly on rights-of-way, is to reconsider the operational role that our rights-of-way and our other managed landscapes play. In some cases, this requires, fairly small changes in management practices, but in other cases, they're pretty significant changes. It requires additional training, revising protocols and standards, communicating about what we're trying to do differently and why, and really trying to change the perceptions that rights-of-way have. So of course, this type of shift is going to come with hurdles. And in reviewing all the feedback we've received at past working group meetings and breakout discussions we've had, we know that there are still gaps that we need to address in order to build a better business case for habitat. Each of our organizations has its own sensitivities and culture and personality, and so in order to build an effective business case, we really have to recognize that each organization is going to look slightly different, depending on, again, those unique factors. However, I think that there still can be some broad trends. There's some universally really compelling arguments to be made for habitat, and there's lessons that we can certainly learn from each other. So what has developed is this idea that maybe if we developed a menu that could be a resource to help organizations, again, approach a business case, this sort of tool and resource, kind of aggregating all that information together, could be really helpful. What if we could, again, grab all of the possible business case scenarios, group them, provide supporting data and resources, tools and case studies where they're available, basically create this library. So organizations would have a reference point. They could pick and choose, which pieces of the business case make the most sense for their organization, and really, again, kind of order off this menu. So on your tables, you'll find what is essentially the start to this menu. And no doubt we will be asking for feedback on this over the course of the day and future weeks and months. But our presentations really are going to focus on just a handful of these business case opportunities and the themes. And I hope by the end of the day we'll really be able to continue to add and expand some of these ideas. So I'm going to invite Kristine up just to introduce again a couple of some of the business case options, particularly some of those that she's finding have a lot of traction in her work in Iowa. And so I will turn it over first for her to talk about carbon sequestration. And I got ahead in my slides, sorry.
The electricity and transportation sectors together are responsible for over half of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. So carbon sequestration represents one way that transportation agencies and utility companies can show they're being good stewards of the land so they can offset some of these emissions. In 2008, the Federal Highways Administration established the carbon sequestration pilot program. The goal was to see how feasible it is for state DOTs to sequester carbon if they alter some of their management strategies. In 2010, they came out with a report finding that right-of-way vegetation in the national highway system already sequesters 91 million metric tons of carbon. The report also estimated there's around 3 million acres of right-of-way that's not paved and potentially available for carbon sequestration. Up to 7 times more carbon could be sequestered with management practices that increase the vegetation biomass to sequester even more carbon. They estimated there's a total potential value of $8.5 to $14 billion nationwide at a cost of $20 per metric ton. So this amount can vary quite a bit just depending on what the cost of carbon is. So this assumes that the carbon would be sold through a cap and trade system, is how they came up with their estimate. They selected New Mexico as a case study. New Mexico has a lot of rural roads. They have a lot of grasslands and forests. So they thought it would be a good state to start out with a pilot study. They established 8 test plots in northern New Mexico, which tends to have more rain than the other parts of the state. They studied 3 ways you could potentially increase carbon sequestration. 1, raising the mowing height. So you're increasing the biomass of the vegetation and increasing the carbon that can be stored in the soil. Seeding legumes into established right-of-way grasslands. So the legumes could increase plant productivity and increase soil carbon. And soil imprinting, where you create divots in the ground, and the divots can help retain water and nutrients. And again, increase plant productivity, increase the carbon in the soil. So what they found was, well, first of all, they did this for 3 growing seasons. Seeding legumes didn't take off. It just, after 2 growing seasons, they had to stop because the legumes weren't establishing. Soil imprinting, they found no significant difference in nutrients or carbon in areas that had been imprinted with these little divots as opposed to areas that weren't imprinted. And mowing height, if they raised the mowing height, well, there's more above ground biomass, but they didn't find any significant differences in carbon stocks. So these particular methods in this area did not show a lot of positive results, but what they found was they realized even though they were in the wetter part of New Mexico, overall it was just too dry to show significant effects of some of these management practices. And they suggested that the eastern states where there's more precipitation, that's where you would see some of the greater benefits for carbon sequestration. That was one of the overall findings of the report, was that these would probably be more effective in eastern states. The more rainfall, the more vegetation differences you're going to have with these management methods. There's a couple of resources out there if you want to determine the feasibility of sequestering carbon for financial gain. One was a report that came from the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, the guidebook for designing and managing rights-of-way for carbon sequestration and biomass generation. So this is a guidebook for state DOTs that helps them determine if local conditions are favorable for getting carbon credits. So the focus of this guidebook is the revenue potential. There's a realization that even if you don't have a lot of revenue potential, the DOT can still show they're being good stewards of the land. But this focus is on how do you determine if you can get a revenue potential. So basically, the DOT has to determine their costs of establishing the vegetation, of planning your management versus the revenue based on what the cost of carbon is at the time. So it's no clear-cut answer. It just depends on local conditions whether the DOT can get revenue for carbon sequestration or not. But it is possible. And again, it depends on the market a lot, what the carbon is going for, what the costs are in establishing the vegetation. So this is the main guidebook I found out there. Another resource is the Federal Highways Administration Carbon Sequestration Estimator, and the light version as well. And these are spreadsheets where the DOT can enter their costs associated with various management regimes and again determine from a financial point of view if they can get revenue from carbon sequestration. Now another benefit that people might not think of is safety. A couple of studies have looked at the effects of vegetation on driver stress. These studies have participants look at videos of different scenarios. So the top, for example, would be a very paved, human-dominated landscape all the way to the bottom where there's a lot of vegetation. Studies have found that participants have lower stress levels when they're viewing driving scenes through heavily vegetated areas compared to the less vegetated areas. And they also have less frustration. So they'll have people look at the videos and then measure how long they spend trying to solve these impossible to solve anagram puzzles. And apparently people will spend more time trying to solve these impossible puzzles after looking at the vegetation. They have a higher frustration tolerance. They're just calmer. They'll just work away. So that's one way they measure frustration tolerance, apparently. It's kind of fascinating how they measure some of these sort of things. Another aspect of safety, this is kind of interesting. So trees are not allowed in the clear zone by highways. So the clear zone can be anywhere from 7 feet to 46 feet, just depending on highway speed limits. But if the trees are kind of close to the clear zone, people actually drive more slowly because they perceive there's a risk. They have fewer crashes and they have less severe crashes. Because there's that perception, oh, the trees are there, I need to be more careful. So people actually drive more carefully, which is kind of interesting. So these safety studies have looked at trees. I'm having a hard time finding studies that have looked at herbaceous vegetation, the effect of herbaceous vegetation on driver behavior or driver stress and tolerance. So that'd be really interesting to have for our white paper, because I know some of us are working with herbaceous vegetation. That's kind of some interesting findings that vegetation can have safety benefits if it's sited properly. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And I didn't put a slide for this, but one safety benefit I've heard some people say, if employees are spending less time mowing, that's a safety benefit because people aren't on the steep slopes of highways. They're not out in the traffic mowing as much. That's a benefit some people have said if they're trying to reduce mowing. With that, I'll pass it back over to Iris.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm sure many of you have also considered the other safety-related issues to reducing incidents. So early successional habitat, and in particular low-growing vegetation, helps maintain clear sight lines, particularly important at railroad crossings, intersections, and other potentially dangerous areas. Same low-growing vegetation provides safer access for employees and contractors. And then, as it has been discussed plenty of times in this group, also, of course, in electric utility areas, reduces the chances of contact with transmission and distribution lines. So other important safety considerations as well. Another important approach, and this is also included on that outline, is to think about engaging across the functional areas within your organization. So thinking beyond your silo, thinking beyond the department that you work in, what are the benefits and opportunities that are available to other business areas. This also can help be really important in leveraging resources that are available potentially to have habitat benefits. And additionally, the more benefits that we can find across our organizations, as we stack those up, we have a more compelling business case. So again, thinking about looking outside kind of your typical business operations and who else within your organization could possibly see some benefits. We're going to be, again, going into more depth of some other of the business case topics. So specifically this morning we'll be talking about demonstrating cost savings. We'll be addressing the regulatory uncertainty concerns and how those can play into a business case. And then in the afternoon we have providing ecosystem benefits, looking at several different approaches to how ecosystem benefits can feed into business cases. Also supporting invasive species management. And then lastly, thinking about the positive public relations impacts that can come from these projects as well. So with, again, a full agenda there, but I, again, want to go back to this idea of this outline. And so as you're listening to presentations, having discussions today, I really want you to keep in mind, what ideas come to mind. Big ideas, small ideas, well-developed ideas, not developed ideas. Any of those that come to mind, put them on a sticky note and put them over on the side wall over here. And we're going to collect all that information and continue to flesh out, this outline and again, ultimately what I think will be a really helpful resource. Also, as Kristine mentioned, we're looking for information on case studies, tools, data that's out there that can help, again, further justify some of these business cases, literature, research studies, any and all of that. I think, if we can aggregate in a central place, will be a really helpful resource, not only for this working group, for others that are, trying to get into habitat initiatives. Following the meeting, we will also be posting a more, I guess I would say, complete version of this outline. It's certainly in draft form, but we do have a more fleshed out version of the outline that has specific case studies and information and resources that we've identified to date. So we'll make that available on the working group resources page. And again, would really encourage you to review that, add comments and again other ideas and information as you have it. And I'm really excited to see what as a group we can do to create again a really robust resource. Of course, feel free to contact both Kristine and I. We're collaborating on this project and really invite you to collaborate with us to make it as complete as possible. So before we move on, any questions for either of us about this outline, what we're trying to do, kind of the theme for the day? You excited to learn about the business case? Okay. Thank you, Kristine.